next presenter is Alminas from NUS, and he'll be presenting Geopolitical Pressure, Consumer Demand, and Corporate Responses. Over to you.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, organizers, for including the paper. Unfortunately, I'm from here, so I can't blame jet lag on anything. I would like to apologize, though, to the discussant for the preliminary version that he has received of this work. Although we've been working on it for a while, Jūra and I started discussing these ideas actually at the onset of Russian invasion in 2022. She even wrote an article in Washington Post discussing, how foreign companies are still operating in Russia. And then we had this discussion, like she's in marketing at Cornell, and I'm in finance here at NUS. She had this view that if anything, the foreign corporations would only respond to the investor pressures. So she had this finance view. And for me, like from finance, I thought it's only from consumer demand, that the local domestic consumer demand, that there could be a pressure for the foreign companies to withdraw from the Russian market. So we had this coming from very different perspective, not believing our own fields. We started this project, and then joined. He's here as well, and he'll run around during the break asking you for the opinion as well. So what do we do? So this is like a history, but also in terms of more setting up the broader picture of where we're coming from. So some of my work is also looking into this, the firms, how the investors can have extraterritorial reach of their decision via investing into U.S. public firms with the supply chain links in the foreign countries, and how we can influence the foreign operations through the investment of U.S. public corporations. But many of these scandals, environmental social scandals, are actually kind of endogenous and self-inflicted, and so it's very hard to find the sentiment where find the setting, or find the environment where the company is actually not responsible for what is happening, in the first order of things. And Jūra has all this research on consumer boycotts, where the identification of the consumer demand effect actually within the U.S. when there's polarizing, Budweiser or Goya or a few of these well-known scandals create this polarizing view that some consumers stop buying, but others start buying, and because of kind of short sale constraints of the people who did not buy, they can't go negative into buying. Actually, you don't necessarily see a consumer response, or see a positive response to any polarizing view because of the partisan take. In this case, what we're looking at is this Russian invasion of Ukraine, which placed multinational firm Russian operations under public scrutiny. And in this case, the environment was beyond firms' control, we think, but also kind of politically bipartisan, at least at the beginning. I think both parties, both sides of the political aisle, kind of, and the voters were on the same side. And then what happened in early March 8th, Yale NUS Hall, Yale list was announced, so-called Yale list, that came from the center, that publicly classified firms as exiting Russia's market or continuing their operations. I'll describe how many firms we have on the list in more detail in a second. And this classification helped turn this as a kind of public debate. Should the firms leave Russia's market? What kind of pressure that would create? And also what kind of pressure us as stakeholders, consumers, investors, social media activists can have on the firm's position to exit the market or not. So it's kind of inaction by itself became an important kind of consideration for some people, and again was at the beginning lots of media discussion, including some of the articles that Jūra has published. All right, so many firms subsequently withdrew operations from Russia. And in a sense, the way I present this paper and some of the results is kind of like a forensic paper that we're trying to figure out, we're trying to find what is happening. We think we have a research question, but it's not sort of as well defined as all this beautiful presentation we've seen so far, to be honest. So what do we ask? We ask sort of, do firms respond to these noisy domestic stakeholder reactions? Or they observe the consumer demand response domestically in the US. They observe investor reaction. They observe Twitter buzz, and whether that sort of means anything for, sort of, can we use that to predict their future actions? So we track multinational firms' decisions to withdraw from Russia, as probably you have inferred so far. We link that to the stakeholder responses, the three that I described. Of course, there can be more. There can be employee reaction, other stakeholders. And then we look at, primarily, sort of, we look at the consumer-facing brands that did not face direct sanctions and kind of largely had operational flexibility on whether to continue operations. One could argue there still could sanctions like dealing with banks, getting money out of Russia. So, but as a first order, they could still operate at least for the first few months in that market. Importantly, also, as you'll see, sort of the type of the brands we're looking at, it was difficult for those. These are kind of like restaurants, hotels, and so on. So it's difficult to. It's not consumer goods itself, so it's difficult to use some third party, Belarus or Kazakhstan, to export to Russia and claim, have the plausible deniability that you exited, but actually don't do it. All right, so data is the Yale list with public classification, and then we use this comprehensive data that Kiev School of Economics has created, panel data, that they sort of track over time. Actually, their data is much larger than the Yale list. So Yale list only listed a fraction of the firms that operated in Russia. So there's a salience effect of being named in that list, but also sort of it helps us. This actual data, as we take it as ground truth, the Kiev School of Economics data set allows us to track over time what firms are doing. Now, in terms of consumer response, we use this weekly credit card-based point of interest level spending data at U.S. brick-and-mortar locations. So we have restaurants, retail, grocery, hotels, entertainment, museums, all the sort of places where you spend. So it's different from the, if you've heard of this Nielsen retail scanner data, where you see the actual products being bought. We know the locations where they're spending rather than what kind of products being purchased. But we also do similar analysis with the Nielsen data and find find kind of interesting results that I'll share a little bit. And then on Twitter, we just do the firm mentions linked to Russia-Ukraine conflict keywords. All right, and then the stock return data. So, in the end, the full universe in the Kiev School of Economics list is around 4,000 firms, and then out of those 4,000, 200 are these type of firms for which we have the credit card spending data. So others likely are B2B or firms without a U.S. presence and so on. 64 of those 220 are mentioned in the Yale list, so the majority are not mentioned in the Yale list, even though they had Russian operations and they are in this SafeGraph data set. Most of them announced that they will curtail operations at the Yale list release time, March 8th, 2022, and 10 said they would remain. And out of 220, we have 50 that are publicly listed, others not. So I'll very quickly run through the findings. So first, Yale list was a public salience event. So when it was released, there was a lot of the Twitter reaction, a lot of salience on, but it kind of died out very quickly. So people forgot and moved on. Okay. So then what we look at is the reaction in terms of in the weekly SafeGraph spending, how the firm is announced in that list, whether it remains or curtails operations, is whether it's important or not. If it remains, the spending drops, the tweets increase, there's no investor reaction. So that's kind of interesting already. I think sort of there is some consumer demand response. And let me now go through these findings and sort of a bit deeper from the investor reaction. First, there's no reaction, so that's interesting. But there's a reaction on the day of invasion. So investors realize it way before, so they know where the operations are, and the Yale list itself does not add additional information. Now Twitter, yeah, we see an increase, and we kind of believe it that there is a lot of the Twitter reaction, and there are other papers looking into this thing as well. Now demand, the blue line is the remain, so the demand drops, but what we sort of realize then, digging deeper, is that when we do it, I will not go through details of how it's constructed, but when we do it sort of equal weighted rather than spending weighted, which is here, then we don't see sort of a difference between if the firm remained or curtailed its operations. We try to dig even deeper. So, okay, maybe we'll find some heterogeneity in terms of the type of counties where the spending is. How much Ukrainian diaspora there is, more educated, less educated, Democrat lean, and so on, household income, population density. And if anything, sort of our priors would have been different. Sort of the response is higher. The negative response on if the firm is in the remain category is higher if the county has less Ukrainian diaspora, less educated, less household income. So we can't sort of use that as the evidence either. How about Nielsen data? The consumer packaged goods data also sort of no significant differences. So maybe sort of what is actually happening then, sort of the only sort of finding for which we can stand here is that the effect is just there for the more visible firms. Okay, so when we sort of interact, remain with the how visible the firm is in the Twitter or how much spending there is, so pretty much the size of the firm and how visible it is. That's pretty much where we find sort of the strong effects. So what really matters for the consumer response is only when it is combined with a lot of visibility for the firm. For the small firms, the consumers did not respond even if that was on the list, which is, I guess, intuitive. All right, and now do the firms respond to these stakeholder signals? We'll go through sort of 3 stages. The firm could stay, could announce an exit and then exit, and sort of we try to predict by the changes in consumer demand over 2 weeks around the Yale list release or around the firm announcement, the first firm announcement, and do the same for the changes in the Twitter following, and then sort of see the changes in the cumulative abnormal returns. Let me sort of, I think I mentioned most of them. We'll control for the Russian exposure and the size of the firm itself. So that's sort of the main takeaway here, the main table. So just being announced on the list, if you're announced that you are reducing operations, increases the probability that you'll exit. The Twitter volume itself is very important, so the public attention is the most important one. And then when we try to look into the demand shift, the change in the consumer demand, maybe sort of when we control for everything else, but then the sample drops, with this subsample, maybe we see some of the effect. In terms of the previous announcements, what happens around the early announcement helps the firm learn, check the temperature with the investors, with the consumers, and has also some predictability on whether they change their decision to leave Russian market or not. All right, so just to put that in words, the curtailed firms exit faster across all specifications. Twitter attention consistently predicts exit, and demand response are much less consistent. And then the firms learn from the earlier announcements. And sort of going back to what I said before is that we see consumer response more when there is for higher firms, larger firms, for firms with a bigger attention, bigger spending. When we sort of interact the size and the previous visibility, this will be the last 2 rows of the coefficients. We do see that if the consumers reacted less negatively over the risk of A-list, and these firms were sort of more visible, then we see higher probability of exiting. And then also sort of there's learning, how the consumers reacted if the firm was large on the predictability on the exit. We do the same with the spending. Results are somewhat similar. Now, whether they fully exit only depends on their Russian operations. So, in terms of when I told about the exit, it was only the partial exit so far. The full exit can only be predicted by Russian operations. What happens in the US market does not really matter. Similar things for Nielsen data. I'm kind of running out of time and not go through the robustness checks. Let me just conclude. So the A-list made this continued operation in Russia visible, and the public attention does predict mostly the biggest predictor is public attention from the Russian market. So neither Jūra nor I was scared. It was neither investors nor consumers. It's just how much social media was talking about it. And the demand only is important for the highly visible firms. So it's kind of like a governance by the masses that pushes the social media, and the attention pushes the firms to adapt to their operations to the current sentiment, political sentiment, geopolitical sentiment. Thank you, and look forward to Rainer's discussion.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to read this paper. And before I start with my comments, let me just talk a little bit about what the event actually means. So we're talking about US firms' response to the invasion of Russia in the Ukraine. And from my perspective, my reading about this event is that there were sanctions, but the sanctions in the US were about new investments. So corporates were not allowed, after this Russian invasion, to make new investments into Russia. But whether the firm continued their operation or not is, from my understanding, something that was a voluntary decision. And this decision, whether you exit the Russian market or you curtail your operations, likely depends on either higher political costs or operational uncertainties, or alternatively that you have reputational concerns or consumer risk, that your home consumers in your home market in the US react to this. And this paper clearly is about this second part here, because they are not looking at the invasion itself. That might be more about the first shock, where you have this increased political risk, which I think is more a geopolitical risk. But this paper is about the second one, because it looks at the list, this Yale list, where the decision of US firms to exit or remain in Russia was published and made very salient to the consumers. So this event is likely about this. So why should US consumers care about the US firms' decision to exit or not? So mostly from a European perspective, I think the hope was that if Western firms leave Russia, it will weaken the Russian economy, and maybe also it will raise domestic pressures within Russia to end this war. So the idea is that this decision maybe has a positive externality to potentially end this war and maybe bring peace. So the first thing is, the bad news is that while a lot of Western firms left Russia, actually, for one of the two reasons, I'm not separating it here, it didn't have the intended consequence. So this is an example of McDonald's. So when the franchise left, Russians took over, and just the name changed, basically. Everything else remained very similar. And also the economy seems to go quite well. This is just a photo from a Russian restaurant. at least the elite, which is maybe important to influence the Russian decision on this warfare, was probably not very adversely affected from what I know, at least, about this event. But I'm not going to talk much about the research question of the paper and what the paper does, because Alminas was presenting this, I think, in a very clear way. But as I said, so it's a very nice shock that is about not about anything real that happened, because the invasion happened before. So you can somehow, from the timing, separate the impact on your corporate operations impacted by this invasion from a shock where your consumers somehow get saliently disclosed how you behave with your Russian operations. And so I think it's a quite interesting shock. And what they do is they look at 3 different things. So they have fantastic data and very, very micro level data, and the empirical analysis is very carefully conducted. They look at consumer demand in response to this publication of this Yale list. They look at public attention via social media channels, and they look at price reactions by investors around the publication of that list. And the main findings can be summarized as follows. So the publication of the list did spur attention. So the firms that remained saw a sharp spike in Twitter posts, and those firms that curtailed the operation saw less of that. So for consumer demand, for a subset of firms, they do see that demand actually dropped. So US consumers seem to respond somehow, and there's no pricing effect. In line with investors already having the information, there was no new information for investors. I mean, if demand falls because of that, I think prices should also fail. So I'm not sure if these 2 things are clearly aligned, but overall these are the main findings. And as I said, I think it's a very interesting event they have identified. And they have fantastic data, and the empirical analysis seemed very clean, so I'm not going to comment on this. I have just 2 comments about this paper, and one is about the pitch, and one what could be further done with the analysis. So far, if you read the introduction, but as indicated, it's a very early version. The pitch moves around different literatures, has political economy, but also marketing and corporate finance references. And the question I asked myself when I thought about this event is this paper really about geopolitical risk? Because I believe that this first event, the invasion, this is really the event about geopolitical risk. The publication of this Yale list, I think, is really more about something where you worry about the your consumers or your investors, which attitude they have about your company. And I think what you could do is you could maybe learn from this event something which is an open question in finance. Why do firms undertake corporate social responsibility or ESG activities? I think you can maybe separate whether corporates do this just to maximize shareholder benefits, or whether this is done for some bigger other purposes that corporates have. And I'll explain how I mean that and why I think this is a nice shock to learn something about this. Because you can think about this event actually as being a negative CSR shock for firms that comes quite exogenously. So the Yale list got a lot of attention, firms didn't expect it, and suddenly the companies experienced this attention via social media. So it's really like there's no real shock with the publication of the list, but you have a negative shock in the news about your firm. And I think there are several recent papers that can guide you. So I'll cite several papers of Michael Greenstone in the next minutes. So there's a beautiful one about environmental governance. So in China, they did, in a recent AR paper, they were testing whether you did some some violations in pollution, whether you did some private appeal to the company or you made a public appeal via social media, and they found out that the latter was much more effective. And I think your shock is very, very similar to actually the event they use in this AR paper. And there is a literature, mostly by Christian Lloyds and others, on the real effects of disclosure. So basically, this is a disclosure event, and I think you could pitch it in this direction. And but to move on, how you could actually separate whether this is in line with pure shareholder value maximization, the reaction to the Russian invasion, whether you exit or not, or whether you follow some other common purposes, I think you can actually do more with the analysis. So my second comment is about this. You have all the ingredients to actually calculate on a firm level the cost-benefit considerations. You see the drop in demand and you see the value at stake in Russia. So you see the profits that the firms have coming from their Russian operations. And there's a paper published in Science recently by Greenstone, Lloyds, and Breuer, and what they do is they show the pollution you do, measured as emissions, divided by the operational profits you do. And they can show within industries that on the firm level, the variation is enormous. So some firms pollute much more than others for the same level of profits. And I think you could make a very, very similar measure where you see like the foregone demand in your products and scaled by the profits you actually have from your Russian operations. And then you could check in the second step, how much is this correlated to your exit decision or not? So do those firms whose drop in demand is relatively high compared to the profit they make from Russia, are those exiting or not? If this correlation is high, you would actually think that this decision is a pure shareholder maximization strategy. If you find the opposite, that despite having a little drop in demand, but having a lot of profits in Europe, and you still leave Russia, you would actually see that those companies that take such decisions are likely those that have a different purpose and that care maybe about Ukraine or Europe and that actually take some decisions which are not in line with the maximization of shareholder value. And I think so that's my main point here. And I think you have a very interesting setup, and I could believe that you could pitch it in this direction, and it would become a very, very interesting contribution. Thank you.
I'll just thank the discussant, Rainer. Thanks. That's very, very helpful. And framing this way could be an interesting way to how to think about this issue. So yeah, thanks a lot.
So apologies for a very small point, but I just wonder about using Twitter as the measure of public attention, because when you're looking at the consumer response in terms of spending, my understanding is that consumer spending is largely driven by older people who might be less likely to be focused on Twitter. And I mean, Twitter might be a proxy for broader media attention or something like that. You know, putting it in those terms might be helpful. But, you know, if you're thinking about, gee, it's the baby boomers who are driving a lot of this spending, and you're looking at sort of consumer spending as your measure, it could use a little more explanation.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder about the long-term versus the short-term effects of this. So there was a sort of a loss of consumer demand for the Remain firms, right? But over what frame, over what time frame, and did it decay, and did it amount to much in the end? You know, it's sort of like there was a shock, but then the Bud Light thing seemed to have persistence. Mm-hmm. And as you sort of suggested, there was polarization. So there were the Bud Light defectors and then the Bud Light supporters and counter to the defectors. But Russia doesn't seem to have, the Russia Remain thing didn't seem to have a polarizing effect. There weren't folks who sort of, said, yes, let's, support the invasion and by buying whatever. And also was there persistence of the negative effect on the Remain firms. And so, I'm just thinking about how firms behave. If it's a week effect, then that'll have one set of responses. But if it deteriorates the brand in a persistent way, then that'll be kind of different. And I'm not sure how the data you've collected addresses that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we do look into it's a weekly data, but we look into a few months, and it seems that the effect is persistent. But of course, some of these Remain firms then change their position as well and shifted to curtailing operations and exiting the market. Now, what you mentioned about polarizing, I think that's sort of kind of the benefit of this. Benefit is a bad word, yeah, probably, but sort of the advantage of the setting, looking into this question, because then we look into whether the effects could be persistent. Exactly what you're asking. We can study whether the effects could be persistent. And this is what we find, is that at least over the first few months, the effects are somewhat persistent and they don't go back. Now, the way we construct the data, maybe I ran very quickly through that. So let's say we look at McDonald's spending in a particular county in the U.S., and we compare it to like Taco Bell that does not have Russian operations. So this kind of, we try to remove all these sort of spending trends, county preferences for certain products or for certain types of products. So this is all in comparison to how they're spending on other similar category, same category products or services. So we do see persistency, but also this is all relative to what they're doing with the other brands. So they might be like helping other brands that announced the exit earlier. Thank you.